Hi, everyone, and welcome to Stat's virtual event, Biosimilars Meteoric Moment, s- sponsored by Samsung Bioepsis. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ed Silverman. I'm the Pharmalaw columnist and senior writer here at Stat, and I'm sure you know how this works by now, but before we get started, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. So please use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the Stat team. Please don't put your questions for us in the chat though, okay? If you do have a question that you'd like to ask during the event, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote, so to speak, the questions you'd most like to see answered. We'll be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit anything. This is what makes these events engaging and fun. It's a conversation. We want to hear from you, and again, thanks for being here. But before we get started, I'd like to welcome Thomas Newcomer, Head of U.S. Market Access at Samsung Bioepsis, for a sponsored introduction of today's event.
Thank you, Ed, for having us today. Today's discussion is important because our U.S. healthcare system continues to be faced with various external challenges. The COVID pandemic, for instance, is now in its third year and continues to affect our economy, which also happens to be burdened by growing inflation rates. As Vice President and Head of U.S. Market Access at Samsung Bioepis, I routinely hear from customers, payers, PBMs, hospitals, clinics, about the growing financial pressures on their healthcare organizations. Small or large, private or public, they are all faced with these growing pressures. Biosimilars, which are defined as biologic medicines that are highly similar to the reference product with no clinical meaningful difference, have the potential to become the pressure valve for the U.S. healthcare system, which is suffering from aggravated financial burden. The first biosimilar came to the U.S. market in 2015, and since then, 20 have been improved. Years of experience of biosimilars have shown that they are helping to drive down healthcare costs through competition and expand access to treatment by providing more treatment options while offering similar clinical outcomes as reference products. The potential for biosimilars to drive down costs can be seen as an important lever in facilitating innovation in novel biologics, creating more headroom for the next wave of innovation in neuroscience, oncology, cell, and gene therapy. Innovation needs to continually occur, and biosimilars can play an essential role in supporting long-term sustainability of the U.S. healthcare system. Samsung Bioepis, as a biopharmaceutical company with a mission to broaden access to life-changing biologic therapies, is helping to strengthen sustainability of the healthcare system by developing and advancing a broad range biosimilar portfolio. We have 6 biosimilar products approved and marketed around the world, and another 4 products in our biosimilar pipeline. In the US, 3 of our products are currently available: a biosimilar for infliximab, 1 for trastuzumab, and 1 for ranibizumab are all available in the US, covering various therapeutic areas, including immunology, oncology, and ophthalmology. We also will have our biosimilar adalimumab product available in the US in 2023. Next year will be a meteoric moment for biosimilars, as there will be up to or more than 8 biosimilars launched in the adalimumab market. Humira is one of the most prescribed medicines in the United States and also one of the most expensive. Biosimilar competition for adalimumab is expected to bring positive change to the market, cost savings for payers and PBMs, and expanded treatment options for healthcare institutions, physicians, and patients alike. As a biosimilar company that also has a product lined up for the launch, we are excited for the journey waiting ahead in the months ahead. I look forward to hearing great insights from biosimilar experts today through this Stat conversation. We appreciate the time that you are all giving to us today. Thank you so much, and back to you, Ed.
Thanks, Thomas, for the introduction. And here to join me for today's discussion, please welcome Madeline Feldman, President of the Coalition of State Rheumatology Organizations and Clinical Assistant Professor of Medicine at Tulane University School of Medicine. Stephen Horvitz, President and Founder of EMC Analytics Group. Darius Lakdawala, Director of Research at the USC Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics. Quintiles Chair in Pharmaceutical Development and Regulatory Innovation at the USC School of Pharmacy and Professor at the USC Price School of Public Policy. And finally, last but not least, Michael Sherman, Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Point 32 Health. Thanks all of you for agreeing to be here again. Appreciate your time. Looking forward to the conversation. So let's start at the top. There are now, if I got my numbers right, 39 biosimilar medicines approved in the US, although as we know, not all are immediately available due to patent litigation. But nonetheless, the uptake is gaining traction. In fact, Amgen released a report this morning claiming that therapeutic areas that have launched, that have had biosimilar launches in the last 3 years have now gained an average share of 75% compared to 39% in the preceding 3 years. Meanwhile, a recent report from one think tank suggested annual savings are now about $11 billion, although I'm sure there are folks who will debate that kind of number. But in any event, the conversation has changed. A couple of years ago or so, there was a debate about the extent to which biosimilars would ever sufficiently gain ground to make a real difference in healthcare savings and spending. And today, the talk is more about cementing the inroads they've made, but still there are a lot of questions. And we're going to try to get to some of those big issues today. I'd like to start with the idea of how the uptake has occurred. And Madeline, turn to you because you're in the trenches. What are you seeing in terms of uptake, in terms of physician comfort and patient comfort, and how the climate's changed from, let's say, 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's changed tremendously. Thank you so much for having me. I can remember, as little as 2 years ago, there was some doubt. But every year, I'd say the most recent survey I've seen, nearly 80% and upward of 80% physicians, and particularly rheumatologists, I'm a rheumatologist, have no problem with starting new patients on a biosimilar. There's still some lagging in terms of switching. I think some of that comes from the fact that it takes so long to get a patient stable in rheumatoid arthritis, even compared to, say, an oncologist. And it's a lot of trial and error, so we don't want to do anything to rock the boat. But even that has started to sort of give way a little bit. The unfortunate part is our patients have not seen the benefit in terms of their cost share going down, even though the increase in cost savings. I mean, what I'd buy the reference product for in the infliximab space is over half less than what it was, say, 3-4 years ago.
But you're saying the patients aren't seeing that kind of savings themselves?
No, their cost share seems to have remained about the same, at least for this one particular drug. There are savings in general because the actual price of the medicine. But one thing, that I think people don't, or maybe sort of misunderstand, is that there's a huge difference between the pricing in provider administered drugs, and in Medicare, that's Part B, and the pharmacy side. And we're just this year coming up with the Humira biosimilars, going to be seeing a flood of biosimilars on the pharmacy side. You see the price come down, at least for our drugs on the provider administered side, because all of the rebates have to be reported to the government. So you see an average sales price come down. But on the pharmacy side, if you notice, there really is no average sales price. There's a market share volume and a rebate. And the patients don't really see, they don't pay their cost share on the post-rebated price. They pay it on the full list price. So I'll be curious to see if the patient's cost share next year, when we truly have a pharmacy side biosimilar in the market. We do have one, an insulin, but unfortunately the higher priced one is the one that's been preferred on most formularies for PBMs.
Before we get too far into the future with
Mhm.
Humira, and it's really only a few months away, I'd like to explore a little bit more about the dichotomy you mentioned with the cost sharing. Perhaps Michael, maybe you could provide some added perspective on why and how that's playing out, at least as Madeline has described it, or maybe you have a completely different take.
Yeah, no. So, this is an incredibly complicated topic once you peel away the layers and get below the surface. And by the way, we are, and we maybe can talk more about formulary design later, but we have a couple of different plans this year based on the merger that are different. Some prefer the branded, some prefer biosimilars. We're moving very much in the future toward preferring and encouraging biosimilars. The idea being about lowest net cost. And when we look at lowest net cost, we think of it as the total cost, regardless of the breakdown. The reason that the medical benefit drugs are so complicated in terms of what the individual sees is that in many cases, they have maximum out-of-pocket amounts. That so commonly would be $6,000 for many of our commercial policies, meaning once you hit that, you're not going to see any cost share. So I think many of them who are getting medication on a chronic basis are going to hit that and may not see the direct benefit. A standard cost share short of that, and again, there's different plan designs of 20%, for example, people would be expected to see, but even again, depends the specifics of the plan design, whether there is an upper limit which might protect them. But so depending on it, they may or may not see it. But the other part of this, which is even more important, is keeping healthcare and insurance affordable for everyone. So if the cost goes down, even if it isn't apparent in the cost share, it's lowering the entire cost of providing benefits, which means those dollars are being either reallocated. I like the comment from Tom Newcomer about creating headroom for new drugs, or being used to offset what would have been premium increases. So people are benefiting one way or the other. So these aren't accruing to the payers; they are accruing to the individuals one way or another.
So to what, with all that said, to what extent should we now accept the idea that a biosimilar will be 20 or 30% less than a brand name biologic or the originator product? Is there any hope that we'll see a larger percentage, or is this really now baked into all the equations that we're thinking about going forward?
No. I think we're going to see larger percentages. So one other comment that's created some distortion. So the rebates for some classes of drugs have created distortion whereby 20 to 30% less may not be less than the lower net cost after rebate for other drugs. I think that's created some challenges in adoption and a lack of transparency. What we're seeing now with multiple competitors for a given branded drug, we are seeing it drop below that, and we are seeing points where it is coming in at the lowest net cost, which is why we're preferring. The other thing I'm excited about are changes like interchangeability, which one of the Humira biosimilars will have, which will allow pharmacists, depending on the state laws, to substitute at the point of care for certain pharmacy benefits. So I think the headwinds are decreasing and the tailwinds are improving, and I expect to see increased adoption and material cost savings.
Let me turn to you, Steve, because I know you track industry very closely, essentially from a vantage point of business intelligence. What are you seeing or hearing among manufacturers when it comes to the way Michael just described how the pricing is headed? Does that jive with what you're detecting going forward? Is there any nuance beyond that, perhaps, or is it really a matter of capitulation? The manufacturers now are behaving differently than they did a couple of years ago.
Well, can you see me? I think what's happening is the manufacturers, both biosimilar and branded, they have not really shown all their cards yet. The pricing has not come down significantly with the branded. Maybe there's rebates that are increasing, and the biosimilars have not lowered their price substantially yet. I think, as you called the session, the meteoric rise of biosimilars, I think come July of 2023, there's going to be a new paradigm shift because of the amount of competition, for Humira.
Before we go back to a couple of specifics, with all this said, and I realize that there's more to say, Darius, from a bigger picture policy perspective, what does this tell you? Are we now at a point where biosimilars are achieving the hoped for promise? Is it upon us, at least next year with Humira, as everyone's mentioned, or is it really a case where we still have more to go? How would you characterize the accomplishment so far, again, from a policy perspective?
I think it's good news, but there's plenty of room for improvement is the bottom line. That biosimilars are here to kind of unlock the promise of the grand bargain in the American pharmaceutical system, which is that we encourage innovation with the hope that innovative medicines will become widely accessible when they go generic, and that we're bringing that notion to biologics. There's been progress made. The early biologic launches were lowering price by on the order of 10 to 15%, which wasn't that different than therapeutic competition from a branded product. But if you look at the more recent launches like trastuzumab, for instance, you see in some cases net prices falling by as much as 40% or 50%. It's still not as much as what you see in small molecule generics, where the reductions are more like 80 or 90%. And that's the sense in which we have progress to make. I also think we have progress to make in terms of cost sharing, because there's also been this sort of broader rise of co-insurance in the American cost sharing landscape. And so high priced products of all kinds, not just biologics or biosimilars, are going to impose more financial burdens on patients. And both Michael and Madeline alluded to that. And I think that's another area for us to make progress.
Before we move ahead to anything else, I want to try and take a few of the questions that are coming in, and panelists, feel free to chime in. Don't necessarily feel you have to wait for me to say any one person could or should answer something. I think, Michael, you mentioned interchangeability. One person has a question: of the 7 Humira biosimilars expected to launch next year, only 2 have interchangeability approval. Gather that's correct. How critical is interchangeability for market access? Feel free, anyone who wants to take this, please.
So again, we haven't seen these come out yet, but one would think that if a pharmacist is able to substitute to only 1 or 2 drugs in the entire class, they would have an advantage if something is written for if something is written as less specific. So I think it gives them an advantage in terms of market growth.
One thing though that I've noted in the insulin biosimilar that came out, both were interchangeable and pretty much made by the same manufacturer. And the higher priced ones on the formulary, now the pharmacist, because of the interchangeability laws, could always change it to the lower price one. But if it's not on the formulary, maybe they don't have to get permission from the physician, but if they don't have permission from the PBM and have it on the formulary, they can change it all they want, but the patient's not going to be able to afford it. So interchangeability, unless all of the biosimilars that are interchangeable are on the formulary, it turns into more of an optics thing, so that if a particular payer puts a biosimilar on that's interchangeable, it certainly looks better. But again, interchangeability doesn't mean that the patient will automatically have access to it, even if the pharmacist changes it, because unless it's being paid for, it's still too expensive for the patient to afford.
Yeah, the other nuance here, let me add, is let's assume that the interchangeable one isn't priced higher than other alternatives, because that would also create some distortion. Again, we're trying to move toward lowest net cost, regardless of whether it's a list price or rebate or what have you. So I think we're assuming here that they don't try to charge extra based on that interchangeability. So I think other things being equal, they'll have an advantage.
complicating this might be the fact that you mentioned pharmacists. The idea of different state laws may throw a whammy in there, right? Or is that not necessarily as complicated as it might seem?
Yeah, and so I believe that there are some differences in state laws, and I actually just this morning, thinking about the panel, read a survey done by the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, where they found that many pharmacists did not understand interchangeability and what it meant for biosimilars. So we also have to educate all stakeholders, not just payers and physicians and patients, but pharmacists as well.
Right.
I think there's
but-
also, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that there's also sort of this corresponding need to shift the structure of the market. I mean, in small molecule generics, the locus of decision making is primarily the pharmacy, where there's substitution towards lower cost products, and that's a pretty efficient and simple, relative to the pharmaceutical market, I guess, simpler strategy for keeping costs low. We're not there yet because we don't have full interchangeability across biosimilars. We still have formulary rules. So all these things kind of have to move together. And as Michael alluded to, there's some tension between these different trends. And we eventually want to get to a world where there's interchangeability and movement towards lowest costs at the pharmacy, but that's several years away at least.
Yeah, there are also other tactics that payers can engage in. So, for example, if you'd asked me a year or two ago, I was worried about adoption for a whole variety of reasons. If you only had one or two biosimilars, were they priced low enough to overcome rebates in the background? At that point, greater competition is important, as we all realize. But we're also concerned, we didn't know if physicians would be supportive of this. And we're actually, as we try to prefer biosimilars, we're actually not seeing outcry from the physician community. They're embracing it because they care about overall affordability. And then there are things that payers can do. And for example, even on the medical benefit side, where you don't have tiers and copays, cost shares that are as finely tuned or as many levers, we're talking about that internally. You have the ability to prior off a branded, but not the biosimilar. So you can actually make it easier for the individual to get, easier for the physician to prescribe, and use that as a lever to drive toward the higher value offering. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that over the next year or two.
Okay.
And just the broader commercial market, maybe not a closed health system, it's mandated. Physicians, for the most part, I really don't have a choice. So that, the argument that physicians are hesitant to prescribe it, we are essentially told what to prescribe. Maybe we'll have, and part of the problem is that as it stands now, payers can switch their formularies every 6 months. So I may be mandated for the reference product 6 months, then biosimilar 1 6 months later, and then 6 months after that, biosimilar 3, and then back to the reference product. And I think that's one of the things that physicians have been a little bit leery of, but unfortunately, we really don't have any say-so in the matter. Having said that, I've had very few problems, but the idea of being mandatorily switched every 6 months is distasteful to a clinician that's taken a long time to get a patient stable.
Yeah, that's a fair concern. I don't think anyone has enough experience with biosimilars to know if that's the case. I'll just say, speaking as one commercial payer, again, on the government side, it's a lot more challenging with Medicare. You can make changes mid-year, but it's really complicated, and we try not to. Commercial payers can change things mid-year. Generally, they don't like disrupting care, and if they do, they usually grandfather in those who are on existing medications. But the bigger point here is usually they don't change their preferred offering unless there's a good reason to do so. Either some data that's negative or a different pricing proposal or something. So generally, if they're doing that, it's for a good reason.
And the only way you get the grandfathering is if you go in for the most part and pass a state law, which CSRO, we've been very helpful in getting grandfathered legislation. But again, it's only for that plan year.
So here's a comment/question. Most of the employer's spending on biologics is through the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy. So interchangeability isn't a red herring. The mechanisms to change are there. The real issue is the incentive of the PBM. Thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll let other people speak. I've been speaking on the perverse incentives with the PBMs, and I mean, I can give you examples where they claim that the lowest net cost of a $10,000 brand drug is lower than a $400 generic. And we all know lowest net cost to whom, and it's to the PBM. And until we can reverse some of those perverse incentives where the middleman makes more money on a higher priced drug, but the patient is still paying its cost share on the list price. So even if you get a 60% rebate, the coinsurance is on and the amount of money that's made, we can tell by just looking at the Fortune 10 list. So I think some of those savings should start having direct, not just through lower premiums, but direct impact on patients. And I think acceptance would be much greater if we could actually see that.
I think the price negotiation process for biosimilars still lives inside the branded price negotiation paradigm, where you have formulary placement as being sort of the negotiating leverage to bring prices down. That is distinct from the way it works in generic markets, where it's more the pharmacy negotiating, getting whatever the lowest cost generic they get, and then just switching everyone over to the lowest cost generic. I think that the tipping point will be when we switch over, hopefully in the future at some point, when we switch over from that branded negotiation paradigm to one that's more about just going to the lowest cost product at the pharmacy. And that's off in the future because you need interchangeability first, for sure, in order to be able to do that. And so that's a gating step to get there.
Here's a question from the audience. A lot of times a drug like Humira is covered by the payer after a prior authorization. In this scenario, can the pharmacist interchange Humira to the interchangeable biosimilar without going through another prior authorization?
Yes, that is the intent of the designation.
But again, it would have to be on the formulary. So when the seven come about, there'll be several that looks like we've got one and then another one perhaps on the way of interchangeability. And if only one of those interchangeables is on the formulary, the pharmacist would really only be able to feasibly change it to that one. Because if you change it to the other one, if it's not on the formulary, again, it all comes down to what is being covered on the plan or the employer's plan.
It also depends on again, the net cost. So if you have, a hypothetical drug that costs $100, there's a rebate, so it really costs $60. And the biosimilar that's interchangeable is $70. You're rationally not going to steer someone from what is a $60 drug to a $70 drug, hence my earlier point that, I would hope and I would assume that the manufacturers behave rationally and don't create that unintended consequence, but do actually try to price it in a way where everyone does what you hope they will do and move toward that agent.
I'm not sure the extent to which this might have been touched on previously, so I'd like to run this question by you. The Congressional Research Service back in 2019 said there are 80% discounts on Humira in Europe due to biosimilar competition. What kind of discounts should we expect as we run through next year and 8 or so become available as expected?
If you listen to the earnings call with Mr. Rodriguez, CEO of AbbVie, the motivation behind that 80% was to maintain market share and essentially keep the biosimilars out of the hands of patients. So there is some suggestion that same sort of push to maintain market share. I don't foresee an 80%. But I think they're going to use some of those same aggressive kinds of pricing techniques, hopefully, in order to maintain the market share. The other thing you have to think of is that the company that makes the reference, AbbVie, has several other drugs in the same for the same disease state, that they can also use that leverage in terms of maintaining a preferred spot, meaning essentially they could pull rebates from some of their other drugs in the rheumatoid or psoriatic arthritis space if they don't have it. So they've got a lot of leverage, but hopefully they'll be aggressive about maintaining the market share and reduce the price.
We've heard that that the rebate could be anywhere from 60 to 70 to 75%. When I'm talking about in probably July, and to agree with you, there's Amgen has a pretty robust portfolio of immunologic products also, so nobody knows what they're going to do.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, two additional points, one of which is you see one biosimilar or two, and I think that you see small increases. After that, when you see more alternatives, then it becomes a true marketplace with real versus perceived competition. So, you know, I think that that's worth keeping in mind.
One
Here's
of the
another.
other things that was mentioned was the contracting is generally for 2 years. And they were stating in that on that same earnings call that a lot of the contracting that they do now, if it is for 2 years, even when 24 comes, we may not see the change, the real influx of the biosimilars until after that contracting, that contract is over.
Yeah, well, one other point I also wanted to make that everyone should keep in mind. So Humira is a great drug. It is expensive, and it's often used as a case study. The fact that it keeps on increasing despite no new evidence, in a world where concerned about drug costs and healthcare costs in general, and that's evidence of why the system is a bit broken. So, to the point I'm making here is these biosimilar companies have a lot of room to provide discounts as a percentage and still make a very, very, very big return. So I think also those dynamics do promote greater competitiveness in addition to the number of entrants.
One of the variables they've talked about is the manufacturer of the biosimilars' ability to keep up with the supply. And so if AbbVie allows a second biosimilar on the preferred, it may be part of the choosing of the payers even would be to make sure that a manufacturer that can keep up with the demand is chosen.
So here's another question. From your perspective, do you feel that a biosimilar with an interchangeable designation is actually superior to those without that designation? And if so, why? Who wants to take that?
Well, it's not superior from the point of view of the profit maximizing company launching it, because effectively it reduces a source of market power. You know, I mean, the lack of interchangeability in that sense is valuable, because once you get a patient on it, there's kind of a slight bump towards brand loyalty. But I think the right question to ask is, what will the market do? And the market will favor interchangeability. There'll be a demand for interchangeability. So even though it will drive profits down, ultimately a competitive market will take us to the point, hopefully if it's well functioning and healthy, the market that is, will get to the point where there's interchangeability and more pricing reductions off the biosimilar pricing.
Yeah. So your question in terms of clinical and safety, no, because according to the FDA standards, all of the biosimilars have no clinical meaningful difference in terms of their efficacy or their safety. The difference is they've been able to do switches back and forth between the reference product and that biosimilar, granting it this interchangeability. As we all know, there isn't such a thing in Europe, and they've had switches that have taken place, and depending on what you read, with no significant problems. So in terms of the FDA's thought process on this, no, they are not a superior drug, but they have gone through more switches. But remember, those switches have not been among the various biosimilars. It has only been, and the interchangeability, that's the other thing that we have to remember. They won't be interchangeable, like biosimilar 1, at least according to the FDA, is not going to be interchangeable with biosimilar 2. They will be interchangeable if the reference product has been prescribed.
So with all that said, does anyone here expect the PBMs to always include at least one interchangeable biosimilar on the formulary?
I think
it should be interchangeable.
I think, again, assuming that they are competitively priced, I think that they will be offered and may likely be preferred.
Okay.
Clearly, the PBM has an incentive to give more favorable terms to the interchangeable product. So I think that that's something to expect.
I would agree with that also.
Next question. What is the risk for physicians and or payers if a patient loses remission when switched to a biosimilar? In other words, could a patient sue either the payer or the provider?
Well, I can tell you they can't sue the payer because that has been tried in the past when patients have been non-medically switched. For example, most recently with small molecules and anticoagulation. Because what the payer's response to a lawsuit is saying, we are not practicing medicine. We're not telling the doctor what drug they can prescribe. We're only saying the one that we can pay for. But losing formulary coverage is tantamount to losing access. So it's a question of semantics. But I think in the eyes of the law, it's perfectly legal, but as we all know, probably perfectly wrong.
Yeah, I'm going to half disagree with that. And I'm not a lawyer, so I won't comment on the lawsuit aspect. But I would say that payers have strong reasons for wanting to prefer drugs that are appropriate on label and consistent with guidelines. And on oncology specifically, there are state requirements in most states, including Massachusetts, our largest state, but the vast majority that make it very hard not to cover everything to label. For other areas, I can't think of any example where payers are not offering at least some options in terms of what are considered standard of care, on pathway, whatever, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, based on the physician society. So again, I think if we were going against the guidelines that are coming out of expert societies, whether it's rheumatologists or others, you actually probably could get sued, not on an individual patient level, perhaps, but for having a discriminatory formulary or other things, and probably get in trouble short of a lawsuit with regulators. So I don't think payers are doing that.
I agree with you that they're following the guidelines, but unfortunately the colleges, so for example, American College of Rheumatology, first line guideline after methotrexate is a JAK inhibitor or a TNF or a T cell co-stimulator modulator or an IL-6 inhibitor. So the guidelines are not specific.
Yes.
So I have been witnessed where patients have where a drug has been dropped and no similar mechanism of action drug is left on the formulary. So they will change complete mechanisms of action. You can't go by the guidelines because the colleges tend to make it as broad as possible so physicians have multiple choices. But changing a rheumatoid or scleroderma or lupus patient from a mechanism of action to a completely different one should be illegal, but it isn't because it, as you said, falls within the guidelines.
Yeah, I don't think the majority of payers are doing that. I think, just speaking for ourselves, we try to offer at least one with any given mechanism of action. But I would agree with you. You should not move an entire class off if it is part of the guidelines. So we would agree on that.
Yeah.
A couple of folks have asked about recent decision by EMA that all biosimilars be interchangeable. I'm not sure how many of you can pretend to speak for FDA, but some of you may have some insight into what manufacturers may be expecting. So the question is, will FDA follow suit as we gain more clinical experience with biosimilars?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, one company recently, as I learned, with a branded product, did not need to do a study for interchangeability. This was for coherence. And so is the FDA getting more lax, or is it based on real world evidence? I'm not sure about that yet, but that was kind of unique.
Okay. Someone would like to know if the biosimilar manufacturers will offer a hub-like support service for patients. Many manufacturers right now offer enhanced services for their products. So the question here is, do you foresee the biosimilar companies doing the same for interchangeable biosimilars? Should they?
The ones that I have spoken with have all said, oh yes, we will be offering the same copay cards, the same ability to, run through prior authorization. And certainly if there's a choice among biosimilars for physicians, they are probably going to choose the ones that offer those kind of services because they're helpful for the patients.
Okay. I'd like to throw this question out there. With the new drug pricing reform bill, there's talk about the ramifications for biosimilar launches. And the expectation is that, well, when you have a biosimilar launch, the price will drop to a certain range. But maybe if the brand name biologic manufacturer faces an even lower price point in negotiating with CMS for its brand name product, it might turn around and alter its strategy for the patent litigation and maybe encourage the biosimilar manufacturers to go ahead and launch a drug, because the brand name maker may come away with competition that's not, a higher price point than it would if it has to negotiate with CMS. That's something that I'm picking up on from talking to people in industry. And I'm just wondering if any of you are hearing that as well, the extent to which that alters any of the calculus that you see going forward for any of the discussions we had with pricing, rebating, and formulary decisions.
I think there's a
Sure.
lot of uncertainty. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ed.
There's a lot there, but I'm just curious to hear what you guys are hearing and thinking.
So I think there's a lot of details to resolve and how the price negotiation will work ultimately. One thing that is clear in this context is that there is less of an incentive to deter biosimilar entry, because for one thing, you might end up reducing your revenues so that you're off the price negotiation list, and that's a related issue, I think, as well. So I think that will probably have there's also another question in my mind as to whether there's a notion of an authorized biosimilar, the way that there's an authorized generic, and how that would be treated in the Inflation Reduction Act calculation of a company's revenue as sort of the eligibility for price negotiation. I think these incentives are not productive incentives. They're created, I think they're probably designed to kind of find ways to circumvent the intent of the law. I think that surely you'll see higher launch prices, which is another way to circumvent the intent of the law. So I don't know in the end what this is all going to mean on net. I'm pretty sure that there'll be some competition away. The people will compete away the effects of the law to some extent. They'll figure out ways around the price negotiation provisions. Probably not all the way, but some of it will happen, and then there'll be some reduction in innovation as well on the other side. But how it all plays out is unclear, because some of these details just haven't been clarified, frankly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential unintended consequences. I completely agree. And, I think even the proposal that if there's a high likelihood of a biosimilar within 2 years, it delays the negotiation for the biologics. So again, if you're trying to game that, you come up with a higher launch price, at least for the first 2 years, and don't get in the way of the biosimilar. So I'm sure that a lot of other people are thinking how to do that. Again, just to remind everyone, there's a couple of loopholes here in a law that I think is probably well intended. One of which is we may limit future prices and may limit increases. No one's saying how we get to that starting price. Just to emphasize, that's a pretty big loophole. The other thing I want to emphasize, and we're in Medicare, Medicaid, and commercial in my organization, but this applies to Medicare. There are those who think that we may see what's happened on the provider side, where if hospitals really get hammered on Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement, they charge more to commercial. There's nothing here that prevents the pharmaceutical companies from charging more for any of these drugs to commercial companies to try to make up for it. So again, a lot here that's unknown.
Steve, are you hearing much about this from manufacturers?
No, we haven't touched on that yet. We've been talking, about the incentives. We've been talking about what a big topic is education now. I mean, there in regards to how you educate the doctors in regards to biosimilars. How do you educate the pharmacists? And we've talked nothing about the patients. So, you talked about a hub, but, we've seen from our years of doing this that the hubs of, let's call it generic companies, are not anywhere near what the branded company is. It's not even close. And many doctors, in regards to AbbVie, like what AbbVie's whole hub is, or patient support program.
Okay.
The only thing I've heard in terms of the likelihood of a biosimilar is that if that doesn't occur, then the penalties incurred by that manufacturer will sort of make up for, their postponement of the drug negotiations. So there is a loss there if that biosimilar doesn't happen.
Okay. We still have a few minutes if anyone from the audience would like to throw out a question or two. Please do. There is one question here. Someone asked, just to be 100% clear, outside of the theoretical premiums, will they go up less? Will we not see a scenario where patients financially benefit, like no generic-like tiers with low out-of-pocket costs?
I think anything is possible. I think as we see more, more biosimilars, we may see new plan designs. There haven't been enough to think of biosimilars as a separate formulary design versus just additive to existing because of the number. I think as we see more, yes, you may see more products that have a different cost share impact for individuals where they feel it directly. But I also want to share that when I look across the board at what's happening with our pharmaceutical costs broadly, that those and other things, particularly this year with inflation, but even beyond that, are doing a lot to raise premiums, whether on exchanges or with employers. So anything we can do to drive off a couple of percentage points is viewed as a very large positive by most purchasers.
I think one of the things where we've actually seen improvement for employees and employers are when some of the big three PBMs are somehow pushed out of the formulary construction as a middleman, and the company taking over, whether it was Caterpillar or Costco, and actually are able to get bigger, basically have more savings for the company itself. And at one point, Caterpillar didn't raise its premiums for 12 years for any of its employees. And that was getting rid of a middleman that absorbs. Yes, they may take the lowest net cost drug, but it's the lowest net cost for them. And so I think if we could somehow, part of this vertical integration with the large insurance companies now owning the PBMs has made it more and more difficult for patients to actually see, and even employers to actually see some of those benefits. I mean, we've seen some actual numbers, what PBMs are offering to the employer when we could actually, as a physician, could offer them a lower price. There is a big chunk that's taken out as profit.
I think that's an important point that, as biosimilars gain a foothold, there will be cost reductions, there will be benefits. The question is, where will those benefits accrue? They may not all accrue, or even the majority of those benefits might not accrue to patients. They might be held by intermediaries. That's a question of sort of what the degree of competition is in the market for the intermediation, whether it's PBMs or others. And that, unfortunately, is an area that we continue to need to push on from a policy standpoint.
This question from the audience. The FDA recently held a workshop on enhancing the efficiency of clinical development of biosimilars, and some FDA folks said that large phase 3 trials may not be necessary since bioanalytics are so good at this stage. It implies perhaps that there'll be less clinical evidence. To what extent would that hurt the payer physician perspective on further development?
Well, it's always nice when you have humans in the study, but it may not hurt at all. And it's not that physicians don't get down into the nitty-gritty of the phase 3 studies, but, we're very, very busy taking care of patients and probably not looking through the entire package insert to see what studies were done. I think having that human component still is very helpful, even though I know that a lot of the points are not made on that. it certainly would love, if they don't, then they should have a very good post-marketing surveillance looking for any issues if they are allowed to be approved as a biosimilar. There should be a fairly stringent post-marketing surveillance.
Okay, a couple of more technical questions. One is, do you expect the drug pricing reform law regarding biosimilar reimbursement to doctors at the average sales price plus 8%? I know, Maddie, you were talking about that earlier in Medicare Part B. Will it have any material impact on biosimilar adoption? And if not, what will mostly likely drive adoption?
Well, I can tell you for my practice personally, and for many of the rheumatologists, at this point in time, the reference product is cheaper to buy than the biosimilars. And so the ASP plus 8 won't take effect unless the biosimilars actually have an average sales price less than the reference product. And remember that that extra 2% is just based on the 80% from Part B, not the supplements 20%, which would ultimately be the patient's part if they don't have a supplement. So first you have to meet the criteria that the ASP of the biosimilar is lower than the reference product. And it may be different in oncology. And in that case, yes, I think it might drive. The problem is that we've spent many, many years convincing Medicare that that physicians are not choosing the higher priced drug. And you can look at the rheumatology sphere, the most expensive drug is used the least. So to come back and then try to entice a doctor by paying them more to switch a patient sort of goes against the principles that we've been trying to impress upon on CMS. But again, it has to meet the ASP being lower than the reference product for that ASP plus 8 to be triggered.
Okay, let's step back with a bigger picture question for a moment. What do we think about Dr. Calip as the FDA commissioner, and if it will lead to more drug approvals? And how do we see the life sciences and tools space change with the shift to more biologics being produced?
Well, historically speaking, the FDA is already more on the permissive end of where it's been. And that's been true since probably the early 1990s. It's not a function of particularly recent history. A lot of it had to do with effective lobbying and I think justifiable concerns about HIV drug approvals from groups that were advocating for faster approvals for patients with very severe illness. And now we're at a point where the FDA is willing to approve drugs with modest evidence at best of efficacy, as long as there's a reasonable chance of expecting no harm, and even more willing to take those on in cases of severe illness. Personally, I don't have a big problem with that as a matter of the approval body. I mean, the market needs to sort out whether the drug is worth paying for. I don't know that that's the FDA's, well, it's certainly not the FDA's responsibility, but I don't know how the FDA is going to get more permissive, I guess, in a material way. It's already pretty permissive. It could maybe encourage more competition in terms of its approach to generics and biosimilars too, but it's just not clear to me what the mechanism is given where it is historically.
Yeah, I would second that about being fairly permissive, and also just say that I've realized over the past year my ability to predict what the FDA will do actually has gotten a lot worse, not better, given some of the approvals. And it's based on limited evidence. Again, we're seeing more accelerated approval pathway, which means unmet need, et cetera. Which is good. We'd like to have that more than another anti-TNF. We'd like something that's novel, et cetera. I think most of us agree with that. The problem is, in some cases, there are legitimate concerns over the efficacy. And I will, I guess, slightly disagree with the last comment about the market can determine, because in the majority of cases, if something is FDA approved, and it is, and there's label and there's no other game in town, it is almost impossible for payers not to cover it. So there's no mechanism for maybe the providers, the physicians can decide if they're going to prescribe it or not, but it's very tough. I mean, one of the few exceptions, obviously, is aducanumab, where the data was so bad and there were so many issues that the payers did not cover it, and the providers were aligned with them for the most part. But that's the exception to the rule.
Okay, another question before we run out of time. How realistic is the scenario of payers being able to employ necessary step-throughs for biosimilar Lucentis or biosimilar Humira products to drive biosimilar uptake before patients go to a non-interchangeable or even interchangeable branded drug? Do you think this would apply equally to patients who are currently stable on the branded therapy, who would need to switch, or just the new patients?
I think it is feasible. I think it's ethical if you believe the definition of biosimilars and what they promise. I don't think that payers, and this is something, again, I can only speak for ourselves definitively, but payers in general do not go back and take someone on a stable drug and make them step through a new drug that comes to market for reasons that I would hope were obvious to everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. We don't see them having to step through a new drug, but I often see them having to go back and step through. If you switch insurances, or even if you stick with the same employer and it switches insurances, sometimes, unless you've got state law in there, because we don't have the federal law passed yet, patients will have to go back and step through a drug that they've already failed. And that may not happen, Michael, in your plan, which, bravo for your plan, but that does happen.
Yeah, so it doesn't in ours, but I'd say that's idiocy on everyone's part. And I think probably if you follow the logic more, honestly, more a lack of data, lack of coordination versus anything malevolent, because it's obviously bad for the patient. It's not really helpful to the physician and for the payer to say, let's spend money on a drug that we know didn't work before you get to the one. It also doesn't make any sense. So I think in most cases, payers have gotten better about that. And I truly believe it's inadvertent because it doesn't even make sense for the health plans.
I could tell you stories. The amount of money that is made on the rebates that are kept and the administration fees that are a percent of the list price of the drug oftentimes outweighs any of the so-called costs. And they look at costs as near term. Yes, we don't want to spend more for the drug now. It doesn't make any difference if 10 years from now the patient gets lymphoma from chronic inflammation or a heart attack, because by then they probably will be on a different insurance. And I know I'm sounding a bit jaundiced there. I've seen more than I'd like to see.
All right. And with that last thought, I think we're about out of time. I know we had a lot of questions, and I apologize, and we did not get to every single question. In a way, we think that that's great that a lot of people were tuning in and had something to ask. And I apologize, as I said, if I couldn't get to yours. I do want to thank our panelists again, Madeline, Stephen, Darius, and Mike, for joining me today and for answering some very good questions from our audience. Thanks to our event sponsor, Samsung Bioepis, and to all of you out there for taking the time to join us. Be sure, please, to check out STAT's next virtual event, which is called Can We Share Health Data and Not Be Evil? That's a real question. It'll take place on October 26th. STAT National Technology Correspondent Casey Ross will be piloting that and sitting down with a panel of experts to discuss how to create a data ecosystem that's both effective and ethical. There'll be more info about that program and how to register on our website. So thank you again. Stay safe, be well. It's a pleasure seeing all of you. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.